On a cold December night in the late 1990s, the small town of Welch, Oklahoma, was forever changed by a tragedy that remains unsolved to this day. It was the birthday of 16-year-old Ahsley Freeman, a night that should have been filled with happiness and celebration. Instead, it became the last night anyone saw Ahsley and her best friend, Lauria Bible, alive. Ahsley and Lauria had been inseparable for years. Growing up in the rural community of Welch, their friendship had deepened over time. They spent their days riding bikes, attending school events, and making memories like any other teenagers. On that fateful night, Lauria had planned to stay over at Ahsley's home, a modest trailer where Ahsley lived with her parents, Danny and Kathy Freeman. The evening started like any other teenage sleepover. The girls had spent the day together, likely talking about school, boys, and their dreams for the future. They had plans to watch movies, snack on junk food, and celebrate Ahsley turning 16. No one could have predicted the horror that would unfold in the early hours of the morning. Sometime after midnight, a massive fire broke out in the Freeman home. The flames engulfed the trailer, lighting up the dark Oklahoma sky. By the time neighbors or passers-by noticed, the fire had already consumed much of the structure. It wasn't long before emergency responders arrived on the scene. The intense heat made it nearly impossible to enter the remnants of the home immediately. As firefighters worked to control the blaze, authorities quickly realized something was very wrong. Ahsley and Lauria were nowhere to be found. At first, some believed the girls might have escaped the fire and were hiding somewhere nearby, scared and in shock. But as dawn approached, the situation became even more alarming. When investigators searched the burned remains of the trailer, they found a body, later identified as Danny Freeman, Ahsley's father. But something was off. The fire had not been what killed him. He had been shot in the head before the flames ever started. This discovery turned what was first believed to be a tragic accident into something far more sinister. The body of Ahsley's mother, Kathy Freeman, was nowhere to be found at first. Authorities assumed that her remains had been destroyed in the fire. However, when investigators returned to the scene the following day for a second search, they uncovered another horrifying clue. Kathy's body had been there all along. She, too, had been shot in the head before the fire was set. With both parents murdered and the girls missing, the case quickly turned from a tragic house fire into a full-scale criminal investigation. Who had wanted the Freemans dead? And more urgently, what had happened to Ahsley and Lauria? The last known contact from Lauria came earlier that night. At some point, she had called her mother, Lauria Bible, to check in and let her know everything was fine. Nothing in Lauria's voice or words hinted at any danger. It seemed like a normal night, until the fire and the gruesome discoveries inside the Freeman home. In the hours following the fire, investigators struggled to find any sign of the missing girls. No footprints leading away from the trailer, no phone calls or sightings, and no messages that might indicate where they had gone. Had they been kidnapped? Had they somehow escaped, only to be taken later? Or had they been killed and their bodies hidden elsewhere? As the sun rose over Welch, a town shaken by fear and confusion, the search for Lauria Bible and Ahsley Freeman had only just begun. As the sun rose over Welch, Oklahoma, on that cold December morning, the scene at the Freeman home was chaotic. Investigators worked tirelessly to sift through the charred remains of the trailer, trying to piece together what had happened. With both of Ahsley's parents confirmed dead from gunshot wounds, the focus shifted to the two missing girls. Lauria Bible's parents, Jay and Lauria Bible, arrived at the scene as soon as they heard the devastating news. Like everyone else, they initially believed the fire had been a tragic accident. But when the truth about Danny and Kathy Freeman's murders came to light, their worst fears set in. Lauria and Ahsley were gone. But had they been taken? Or were they victims of the same violence that had killed the Freemans? Authorities immediately launched a search. Law enforcement officers, local volunteers, and even Lauria's family combed the surrounding areas, hoping for any sign of the girls. The rural landscape around the Freeman property was vast. Open fields, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings made the search difficult. Helicopters were deployed to scan the land from above, and tracking dogs were brought in to pick up any scent trails. But as hours turned into days, there was no sign of Lauria or Ahsley. One of the first theories investigators considered was that Ahsley's father, Danny Freeman, may have been involved in illegal activity. He had a history of trouble with law enforcement and had been vocal about his distrust of local authorities. Some speculated that his past may have caught up with him and that whoever had targeted him and his wife had also taken the girls. Others believed that the murders were personal. Perhaps someone had a grudge against the Freemans and had abducted Lauria and Ahsley as part of the attack. Adding to the complexity of the case, there was an unresolved dispute between Danny Freeman and the Craig County Sheriff's Department. About a year before the murders, Ahsley's older brother, Shane Freeman, had been shot and killed by a deputy. The sheriff's office claimed Shane had stolen a car and was armed at the time of the confrontation. However, Danny Freeman had never accepted this explanation and had openly stated that he believed his son had been wrongfully killed. He had even told friends that if anything ever happened to him, the sheriff's office should be the first suspect. Despite this tension, no direct evidence linked law enforcement to the crime, and investigators continued looking at other possibilities. The FBI and the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation joined the case, hoping to uncover leads that could explain what had happened to the girls. With no witnesses and no immediate suspects, detectives turned to the crime scene for answers. They carefully examined the remains of the trailer, looking for anything that might indicate how the fire started or who was responsible. The blaze had been intense, but forensic experts determined that an accelerant had likely been used, suggesting that the fire was set intentionally to cover up the murders and possibly to destroy evidence. However, one of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the complete lack of physical evidence related to Lauria and Ahsley. There were no obvious signs that they had been harmed inside the trailer, and no blood or DNA was found to indicate where they might have gone. It was as if they had vanished without a trace. As investigators struggled to make progress, Lauria's parents took matters into their own hands. Lorene Bible, in particular, refused to give up. She and her husband searched abandoned houses, questioned people in town, and handed out missing persons flyers. They followed every rumor and tip, desperate for any clue that might lead them to their daughter. Despite their efforts, weeks passed with no breakthroughs. The lack of evidence only deepened the mystery, leaving everyone wondering, were the girls still alive? And if so, where had they been taken, and why? As time passed with no sign of Lauria Bible or Ahsley Freeman, investigators widened their scope, exploring different theories about who might have taken the girls and why. The brutal murders of Danny and Kathy Freeman, combined with the apparent abduction of the two teenagers, pointed to a calculated and deliberate crime rather than a random act of violence. One of the earliest theories was that the girls had been kidnapped by someone who knew the Freeman family. The secluded nature of the Freeman property made it unlikely that a stranger would have stumbled upon the home by chance. Investigators looked into people connected to Danny Freeman, particularly those who might have had a motive for harming him. Given his past conflicts with local law enforcement and reports that he may have been involved in illegal drug activity, detectives considered the possibility that the crime was drug-related. Rumors began to spread that Danny had been involved in marijuana sales and that he may have owed money to dangerous individuals. Some speculated that whoever was responsible for the murders had taken the girls as leverage or as witnesses to the crime. However, there was no concrete evidence to confirm this theory. Despite these suspicions, no one in Welch or the surrounding area came forward with any information that could lead to Lauria and Ahsley's whereabouts. Another troubling possibility was that Lauria and Ahsley had been targeted specifically. Authorities considered the idea that someone had been watching them, perhaps an acquaintance or even a stranger who had developed an obsession. Detectives questioned people who had interacted with the girls in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. searching for anyone who might have shown unusual interest in them. But again, no solid leads emerged. The lack of clear evidence forced law enforcement to rely heavily on witness statements and tips from the public. Over the weeks and months following the crime, authorities received numerous tips, many of them leading nowhere. Some people claimed to have seen the girls in different parts of the country, while others reported hearing suspicious conversations that might be related to the case. However, each lead seemed to result in a dead end. One of the most disturbing rumors that emerged was the possibility that Lauria and Ahsley had been taken into human trafficking. While there was no evidence to support this claim, the idea that the girls had been abducted and sold into a trafficking ring was a chilling thought for their families. This theory was considered seriously due to the rising awareness of trafficking cases in the region during that time. Despite efforts by the FBI and other agencies to explore this angle, no credible information surfaced to confirm it. As months passed with no breakthroughs, public interest in the case remained high. Local media continued to cover updates, and national news outlets occasionally revisited the story, hoping to generate new tips. Lauria's parents, Jay and Lorraine Bible, became relentless advocates for their daughter, pushing authorities to keep the case active and refusing to let the investigation fade into the background. Then, a potential break in the case came when investigators received a tip about an individual named Jeremy Jones, a man with a violent criminal history. Jones was already in custody for unrelated crimes when he reportedly confessed to killing Ahsley Freeman and Lauria Bible. He claimed that after murdering Danny and Kathy Freeman, he had taken the girls to a remote location, killed them, and disposed of their bodies in an abandoned mine shaft. Authorities immediately followed up on Jones's statement, searching the area he had described. However, nothing was found. Further investigation revealed inconsistencies in his confession, and Jones later recanted his story, claiming he had made it up to gain attention. The false lead was another devastating blow for the families, who had briefly hoped they might finally get answers. Despite the setback, investigators remained determined to uncover the truth. They continued to interview individuals with potential connections to the crime, re-examining old evidence and pursuing any new information that came in. But as the case stretched into years without resolution, the question remained: was the truth buried somewhere in the past, or was the person responsible still walking free? Years passed with no trace of Lauria Bible or Ahsley Freeman, leaving their families and investigators desperate for answers. Despite the many theories and suspects considered, the case remained unsolved. However, in 2016, new information emerged that would change the course of the investigation. A witness came forward with claims about the involvement of three men: Ronnie Busick, Phil Welch, and David Pennington. According to this witness, these men had been responsible for the murders of Danny and Kathy Freeman and the abduction of the two girls. The witness provided chilling details, including allegations that Lauria and Ahsley had been held captive for days before being killed. Detectives had previously heard rumors about these men, but lacked sufficient evidence to make arrests. They were known to be involved in criminal activities, including drug trafficking and violent offenses. Welch, in particular, had a reputation for being dangerous and had allegedly bragged about the crime to others. However, many who heard these confessions were too afraid to come forward. By 2017, authorities re-examined old case files, revisiting interviews, and collecting additional witness statements. A crucial breakthrough came when investigators found a box of old Polaroid photos that reportedly depicted two young girls bound and terrified. While these images could not be definitively linked to Lauria and Ahsley, they reinforced suspicions about Welch, Pennington, and Busick. In April of 2018, law enforcement finally made an arrest. Ronnie Busick, who was still alive and living in Kansas, was charged with multiple counts, including murder and kidnapping. By this time, Welch and Pennington had already died, taking many of their secrets with them. During questioning, Busick admitted to knowing about the crime but claimed he had not directly participated in the killings. He alleged that Welch had been the mastermind, and that both Lauria and Ahsley had been kept alive for several days before being murdered. Despite this chilling admission, Busick failed to provide the exact location of the girls' remains, leaving their families without closure. In July of 2020, Busick pleaded guilty to being an accessory to murder. As part of his plea deal, he agreed to help authorities locate the bodies of Lauria and Ahsley. However, multiple searches of the areas he mentioned turned up nothing. Whether Busick truly did not know the burial site or was withholding information remains unknown. Though the arrests provided some long-awaited justice, the case still lacked a definitive conclusion. With Welch and Pennington deceased, the full truth of what happened to Lauria and Ahsley may never be revealed. Their families continue to search for answers, hoping that one day their remains will be found and given a proper burial. As of today, the case remains open, and authorities urge anyone with information to come forward. The mystery of Lauria Bible and Ahsley Freeman is one of Oklahoma's most haunting unsolved crimes, a case that has left a lasting impact on those who continue to fight for the truth. Even with an arrest and a conviction, the case of Lauria Bible and Ahsley Freeman remains an open wound for their families and the community of Welch, Oklahoma. While authorities believe that Ronnie Busick, Phil Welch, and David Pennington were responsible for the girls' abduction and murders, many questions remain unanswered. The biggest question of all is, where are Lauria and Ahsley? Despite Busick's guilty plea and alleged cooperation, searches based on his statements have led nowhere. The lack of physical evidence has made it difficult for law enforcement to confirm the exact sequence of events after the girls were taken. Investigators suspect the remains may have been moved or hidden in an isolated area, possibly burned or buried. Without a confirmed location, the families are left in a cruel state of uncertainty, unable to properly lay their daughters to rest. Another lingering mystery is whether others were involved in the crime. Over the years, some witnesses claimed that more than 3 men knew about the abduction, and there were even rumors that others had seen the girls while they were being held captive. However, fear and intimidation kept many silent. Law enforcement continues to investigate the possibility that additional people may have played a role, but without solid evidence, those leads remain speculative. For the Bible and Freeman families, the pain of not knowing has been unbearable. Lorraine Bible, Lauria's mother, has spent more than 2 decades tirelessly searching for her daughter, following every lead and refusing to let the case fade from public attention. Her dedication has kept the case alive, pushing law enforcement to continue investigating long after many similar cases would have been closed. In recent years, the rise of true crime podcasts, documentaries, and social media awareness has helped keep Lauria and Ahsley's story in the public eye. In 2021, a new search was conducted based on potential burial sites in northeastern Oklahoma, but once again, no remains were found. Investigators have stated that they will not stop looking until the girls are located, but time continues to pass, and the trail grows colder with each year. The case of Lauria Bible and Ahsley Freeman remains one of Oklahoma's most haunting unsolved crimes. Though the arrests of Busick, Welch, and Pennington provided some answers, they did not bring the closure that the families desperately need. As of today, Lauria and Ahsley are still missing, their fate unknown, their story unfinished. Authorities continue to urge anyone with information to come forward, no matter how small the detail may seem. For the families, justice will never truly be served until the girls are found and brought home. Until that day comes, their loved ones remain trapped in the painful limbo of uncertainty, hoping that one day, the full truth will finally be revealed. The story of Elmer McCurdy's train robbery is steeped in the rugged history of the early 20th century American West. Born in the late 1880s, Elmer McCurdy's life was marked by instability, poor decisions, and a string of failed schemes. By the time he attempted the infamous train heist in Oklahoma in 1911, he was already a drifter with a penchant for petty crime. McCurdy's lack of direction and expertise, combined with his affinity for alcohol, foreshadowed the chaotic nature of his ill-fated plan. In the fall of 1911, McCurdy set his sights on what he believed would be a lucrative train robbery. News of trains transporting large amounts of cash and valuables had become common, and these moving targets often caught the attention of outlaws like McCurdy. His target was a Missouri-Kansas-Texas railway train, rumored to be carrying a significant cash payout intended for a mining company payroll. To McCurdy, this train was the perfect opportunity to make a fortune. McCurdy, known for being something of a braggart, managed to recruit a small group of accomplices for the heist. While none of them were particularly skilled criminals, they were eager to share in the spoils of the operation. Despite their lack of experience, McCurdy assumed the role of leader, convinced that he could pull off the robbery with little difficulty. The team hastily devised a plan to stop the train and raid its contents, relying heavily on dynamite to access the secured safe on board. What McCurdy's gang lacked in planning, they attempted to make up for in ambition. However, their preparation was riddled with oversights. They had limited knowledge of train schedules and routes, and their strategy for stopping the locomotive was dangerously simplistic. Moreover, McCurdy's overconfidence in his ability to handle explosives would prove to be a critical miscalculation. On the chilly night of October 4th, 1911, McCurdy and his accomplices lay in wait along the tracks near Okesa, Oklahoma. Their plan was to intercept the train, disable its crew, and make off with the payroll funds before law enforcement could respond. They were certain that this would be the big score that would secure their futures. Little did McCurdy know the night's events would not go according to plan. This was the beginning of a chain of missteps and errors that would turn what might have been a calculated crime into one of the most absurd robberies in the annals of American true crime history. As we move on, we will delve into the chaotic execution of McCurdy's ill-fated train robbery and the blunders that sealed its fate. On the night of October 4th, 1911, McCurdy's gang sprang into action, ready to carry out their plan to intercept the Missouri-Kansas-Texas railway train near Okesa, Oklahoma. As the sound of the approaching train echoed through the still night, the outlaws positioned themselves along the tracks, armed and eager. However, from the outset, their plan began to unravel. The gang had intended to stop the train by tampering with the tracks. Their makeshift attempt to force the locomotive to halt proved ineffective, as the train slowed only slightly before continuing on its way. This misstep forced McCurdy and his crew to improvise. They managed to flag down the train further down the line, but the delay had already thrown off their timing, creating confusion among the group. Once aboard, the gang hurried to locate the safe they believed contained a substantial mining payroll. The safe, heavy and well secured, was a daunting obstacle. McCurdy had brought dynamite to blow it open, but his lack of expertise with explosives soon became evident. He packed far too much dynamite around the safe, failing to consider the structural consequences. When the explosives detonated, the blast was far more powerful than anticipated. The safe was blown apart, but so was much of its contents. The intense explosion shredded the cash that had been stored inside, leaving only a handful of coins scattered amidst the debris. The force of the blast also damaged parts of the train car, further adding to the chaos. In their haste, McCurdy and his accomplices rummaged through the wreckage, frantically searching for anything of value. What little they found amounted to a few coins and some other items of negligible worth. The team's hopes of a lucrative haul quickly evaporated, leaving them with far less than anticipated. Adding to their woes, the commotion caused by the explosion drew attention from nearby residents and alerted railroad officials. A train conductor had already managed to send out a warning, which meant law enforcement was likely on its way. Realizing they were running out of time, McCurdy and his crew abandoned their plan and fled the scene. The gang's hurried retreat was no less disorganized than their attempt at the robbery. Scattering in different directions, they hoped to evade capture, but their clumsy getaway left a trail of evidence for authorities to follow. The train car, now a scene of destruction, bore the hallmarks of an amateurish operation, and McCurdy's carelessness would soon come back to haunt him. As dawn broke over Oklahoma, the wreckage of the train car stood as a testament to the gang's bungled effort. While McCurdy had hoped this heist would mark the beginning of a prosperous criminal career, it instead set the stage for a relentless manhunt that would ultimately lead to his demise. Next, we will delve into the aftermath of the failed robbery and the pursuit of McCurdy and his gang by determined law enforcement officers. In the days following the disastrous train robbery, news of the botched heist spread quickly through Oklahoma and neighboring regions. Railroad officials wasted no time notifying law enforcement, providing detailed descriptions of the damage caused to the train and the suspected perpetrators. With their crime fresh in the public eye, McCurdy and his gang became the focus of an intensive manhunt. Despite their efforts to scatter and lay low, McCurdy and his accomplices left behind a trail of clues that led investigators closer to their whereabouts. Fragments of the explosives used on the safe, as well as other tools abandoned at the scene, gave authorities insight into the gang's methods. Additionally, eyewitness accounts from passengers and railroad workers painted a vivid picture of the chaotic robbery, including McCurdy's role as the leader of the operation. As law enforcement pieced together the gang's movements, McCurdy himself was struggling to remain hidden. He sought refuge in rural areas, moving from place to place to avoid capture. To make matters worse, McCurdy's share of the robbery's proceeds was pitifully small. The coins salvaged from the explosion amounted to a few dollars, far from enough to sustain him on the run. Meanwhile, the manhunt intensified. Sheriff's deputies and local law enforcement coordinated efforts, scouring the countryside and interviewing anyone who might have encountered the gang. Wanted posters bearing descriptions of McCurdy and his accomplices began appearing in towns, urging citizens to report any sightings of the fugitives. The allure of a potential reward for their capture only added to the pressure closing in on McCurdy. McCurdy's growing desperation led him to seek help from acquaintances in the criminal underworld. However, even among fellow outlaws, his reputation was tarnished by the sheer ineptitude of the train robbery. Few were willing to risk harboring a fugitive whose actions had drawn so much attention. In a final attempt to elude capture, McCurdy took shelter in a barn located on a farm near Bartlesville, Oklahoma. The remote location provided some sense of safety, but his luck was running out. Unbeknownst to McCurdy, law enforcement had received a tip about his presence in the area, and a posse was quickly assembled to apprehend him. The net was closing in, and McCurdy's days of evasion were coming to an end. Stay tuned for Part 4, where we will explore the dramatic conclusion of the manhunt and the events leading to McCurdy's ultimate downfall. On a chilly October morning in the year 1911, the law finally caught up with Elmer McCurdy, acting on a reliable tip from a local resident. A posse of lawmen surrounded the barn near Bartlesville, Oklahoma, where McCurdy had been hiding. The group, consisting of sheriff's deputies and other local officials, moved cautiously to ensure that the fugitive had no chance of escaping. McCurdy, known for his reckless and stubborn nature, refused to surrender. Armed and barricaded inside the barn, he was determined to fight to the bitter end. The standoff began early in the morning and stretched on for hours. Members of the posse attempted to persuade McCurdy to give himself up peacefully, but their calls were met with silence or sporadic gunfire from within the barn. As the tension mounted, the lawmen had no choice but to return fire. The exchange was intense, with McCurdy firing sporadically while the posse maintained their positions outside. The situation became increasingly precarious as the barn structure began to show signs of the damage caused by the gunfire. Finally, as the sun climbed higher into the sky, The sounds of gunfire from inside the barn ceased. The lawmen, wary of a potential trap, waited before cautiously approaching the structure. Upon entering, they discovered McCurdy's lifeless body lying amidst the debris. The outlaw had sustained fatal gunshot wounds during the standoff, marking the end of his brief and chaotic career in crime. With McCurdy dead, the posse inspected the barn and recovered the few belongings he had left. Among them were a pistol, a small amount of ammunition, and remnants of the meager loot from the ill-fated train robbery. The scene was a stark reminder of McCurdy's fall from a petty criminal to a fugitive who met a violent end. After McCurdy's death, his body was transported to a local undertaker in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. However, this was far from the end of McCurdy's story. Due to his lack of close family or associates willing to claim his remains, a bizarre series of events would unfold in the years to come, transforming McCurdy's legacy into a strange and morbid legend. As we conclude our story, we will dive into the unexpected twists that followed McCurdy's death, revealing how a failed train robber became an unlikely figure of macabre fascination. After Elmer McCurdy's lifeless body was transported to Pawhuska, Oklahoma, the undertaker prepared it for burial. However, when no relatives or acquaintances came forward to claim the remains, the mortician faced an unusual dilemma. In an effort to recoup the costs of embalming, the undertaker made a macabre decision. He preserved McCurdy's body with an arsenic-based solution, a common practice at the time for unclaimed bodies, and put it on display in his funeral parlor. Visitors were charged a nickel to view the bandit who wouldn't give up, and the money was deposited directly into McCurdy's mouth. The morbid exhibit became a local curiosity, drawing crowds eager to see the infamous train robber whose life had ended in such dramatic fashion. For a time, McCurdy's body served as a grim spectacle and a source of income for the undertaker. In 1916, 5 years after McCurdy's death, 2 men arrived at the funeral parlor, claiming to be his long-lost brothers. They expressed a desire to give McCurdy a proper burial in California. Their story seemed plausible enough, and the undertaker released the body to them. However, it soon became clear that the men were not related to McCurdy at all. They were actually carnival promoters who sought to capitalize on the public's fascination with his story. From that point forward, McCurdy's body became a traveling exhibit, passing through various carnivals, sideshows, and wax museums. He was billed under a variety of sensational monikers, such as the Oklahoma Outlaw and the Embalmed Bandit. Over the decades, his body was sold and resold, often forgotten in storage or mishandled by its owners. By the mid-20th century, McCurdy's identity had been largely obscured, and his body was assumed by many to be nothing more than a wax figure. In 1976, during the filming of a television show at the Pike Amusement Park in Long Beach, California, a crew member accidentally broke off what appeared to be a mannequin's arm. To their horror, they discovered human bone inside. Authorities were called, and a thorough investigation ensued. After extensive forensic analysis, including dental records and historical research, the mannequin was conclusively identified as Elmer McCurdy. The discovery shocked the public and reignited interest in his strange life and even stranger afterlife. Finally, in April of 1977, McCurdy was laid to rest in Guthrie, Oklahoma, at the Summit View Cemetery. To ensure that his body would not be disturbed again, officials placed 2 feet of concrete over the casket. After more than 65 years of posthumous wandering, McCurdy's remains were given the dignity of a permanent resting place. The story of Elmer McCurdy remains one of the most unusual in true crime history. What began as a failed train robbery ended in a bizarre journey that spanned decades and captivated generations. McCurdy's life and afterlife stand as a testament to the unexpected twists that can follow even the most unremarkable criminal endeavors. The case of Heather Rich is one that has captivated many across the country. A story that started with the rise of a young woman full of potential, but ended in tragedy and confusion. Heather was born and raised in Oklahoma, where she became well known not only for her striking beauty, but also for her vibrant personality. She was loved by many, and her ambitions seemed limitless. In the beginning, Heather seemed to be on the path to success, pursuing a career that saw her model and act in local productions. Heather's rise to fame, however, would not come without struggles. She was often in the spotlight, and the pressures of fame began to take their toll. Despite having a successful career and a promising future, Heather seemed to retreat further into herself. Behind closed doors, her life was not as glamorous as it appeared on the surface. Her personal life was tumultuous, and her struggles with mental health became increasingly visible to those who were close to her. In the years leading up to her disappearance, Heather's behavior began to shift. She had a reputation for being somewhat reclusive, withdrawing from social events and cutting off contact with many of her friends and family. Her social media accounts, once filled with photos and updates, became eerily silent. While no one could pinpoint the exact cause, rumors swirled about her mental health and potential substance abuse issues. Those who knew her best said that Heather had been dealing with much more than just the stresses of her public life. Despite the mounting rumors and worries, Heather still managed to stay somewhat out of the public eye. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it was clear to those around her that she was struggling. By the time she disappeared, those closest to Heather were already concerned. No one knew exactly where she had gone or what had happened to her, but it was clear that something was terribly wrong. On the night of her disappearance, Heather was last seen leaving her home in Waurika, Oklahoma in the late evening. There were no clear signs of a struggle, and her car was found parked nearby, but Heather herself was nowhere to be found. Family members and friends immediately began searching for her, but no leads came in for days. It wasn't until weeks later that authorities started to seriously investigate her disappearance. As the investigation continued, more details began to surface. It became apparent that Heather's life had been in turmoil for some time. Her struggles with mental health, her strained relationships, and the pressures of being in the public eye were starting to paint a picture of a woman who had been under immense stress. It was also revealed that she had been facing personal struggles, including a difficult custody battle and unresolved family issues, which may have contributed to her decision to isolate herself. But as the days turned into weeks and no sign of Heather emerged, those closest to her began to fear the worst. They began to wonder whether Heather had simply disappeared on her own, overwhelmed by everything that had been happening in her life, or whether something more sinister had occurred. The mystery deepened as investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, but Heather's disappearance remained unresolved, and the search continued. This is just the beginning of the tragic and complex case of Heather Rich. In the following parts of this story, we will delve deeper into the events leading up to her disappearance and explore the many unanswered questions surrounding her case. As weeks passed following Heather Rich's sudden disappearance, her family and friends were left in a state of confusion and distress. Despite their best efforts to search for her, Heather was nowhere to be found. Her case seemed to be heading down a dark path, with each passing day bringing more uncertainty and heartbreak. Little did they know, the truth behind her disappearance would soon take a chilling turn. On the morning of October 12th, 2016, a breakthrough came when a group of hikers stumbled upon a body in a remote area of the countryside in southern Oklahoma. The body was later identified as Heather Rich, and it was clear that her death was not a simple case of a missing person. Authorities quickly declared the circumstances surrounding her death suspicious, and the investigation shifted focus toward uncovering what had really happened. The area where Heather's body was found was located about 30 miles from her home in Waurika. It was a secluded and rural area, making it unlikely that Heather would have simply wandered there on her own. The scene was grim, and evidence gathered at the location pointed toward foul play. Though the body was discovered in an advanced state of decomposition, investigators were able to determine that Heather had been murdered, and her death was not accidental. Forensic experts confirmed that Heather had been severely beaten before her death. The exact cause of death was ruled to be blunt force trauma, and it was clear that she had been targeted with intentional violence. However, there were no immediate leads pointing to a suspect, and law enforcement found themselves in the difficult position of having to piece together a complex puzzle with very few clues. As the investigation continued, more details about Heather's life emerged that raised even more questions. Heather had been involved in several troubling situations in the years leading up to her death. Family members had noticed her withdrawal from friends and her increasing isolation. She had been dealing with emotional turmoil, and there were whispers of a strained relationship with someone she had been close to. Those closest to her were convinced that Heather had been trying to escape the abusive behavior of people she trusted. In the months following Heather's body being discovered, law enforcement began to investigate the possibility that someone from her inner circle may have been involved in her murder. At the time, no suspects had been named publicly, but the authorities were looking closely at Heather's personal life for clues that could lead them to the truth. People who had known Heather in her last days were questioned, and the investigators combed through her past relationships to see if any of them had escalated into something more dangerous. Despite these efforts, the case seemed to hit a wall. The lack of concrete evidence and witnesses made it difficult for investigators to move forward. Heather's family was left heartbroken, desperately searching for answers, but the truth about what happened to their loved one remained elusive. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that there were multiple layers to Heather's life that had not been fully understood by those around her. Her death was a tragic consequence of the struggles she had been facing, and the truth of her murder would require digging deeper into her personal life, uncovering painful secrets and long-buried memories. But the question remained: who had done this to Heather Rich, and why? In the next part of the story, we will explore the various theories and potential suspects that have emerged in the wake of Heather's death, and what authorities have uncovered as they continue to search for the truth. As the investigation into Heather Rich's tragic death continued, the authorities struggled to make significant headway in identifying a suspect. Despite the discovery of her body in a remote part of southern Oklahoma on October 12, 2016, and the overwhelming evidence of foul play, investigators were at a loss for a clear lead. With Heather's life shrouded in mystery and her final days filled with troubling clues, the case began to unfold in unexpected ways. The first breakthrough came when authorities began focusing on the last known interactions Heather had before her disappearance. As investigators spoke with people close to her, they learned that Heather had been engaged in a contentious relationship with a man who had a history of violent behavior. This individual, who had been in her life for several years, seemed to have a volatile and controlling presence in her world. But despite suspicions, law enforcement struggled to link him directly to Heather's murder. Another avenue that investigators explored was Heather's financial situation. In the months leading up to her death, it appeared that Heather was dealing with financial struggles that had caused her significant stress. Although she had once enjoyed a life in the spotlight, she had fallen into a much quieter existence. Some of her closest friends noted that she had been trying to make ends meet, and that she had begun acting erratically. Whether her financial pressures were linked to her murder was still uncertain, but authorities began to explore whether there was any connection to possible motives. As more details emerged about Heather's personal life, law enforcement also turned their attention to the possibility that someone she had trusted deeply may have been involved in her death. Investigators examined her relationship with family members and friends, uncovering tensions that had existed in her life. Yet, there was still no clear suspect, and the puzzle seemed to be getting more complicated by the day. A key turning point in the investigation came when authorities interviewed Heather's ex-boyfriend, who had been known to have a tumultuous and sometimes abusive relationship with her. The ex-boyfriend's behavior during questioning raised red flags, and his answers seemed evasive. Though he initially denied any involvement, his refusal to fully cooperate with law enforcement led investigators to believe he may have been hiding something. Despite his lack of direct evidence linking him to the crime, His potential involvement remained one of the central theories of the case. In the months that followed, the authorities also explored the theory that Heather's murder was connected to someone outside her immediate circle. Some investigators began to consider the possibility of a random act of violence or even an opportunistic crime. However, the more they looked into this theory, the less plausible it seemed. The nature of the crime appeared far too personal and targeted, leading authorities to doubt that someone unknown to Heather could have been responsible. Throughout all of this, Heather's family remained heartbroken and desperate for answers. Her loved ones were convinced that someone knew more than they were letting on. There were many sleepless nights spent hoping for a break in the case, but as time went on, the investigation seemed to lose momentum. The murder of Heather Rich, once a case of intense public interest, began to fade from the spotlight. However, those closest to her continued to fight for justice, refusing to let the case go cold. Despite the lack of a clear breakthrough, investigators were still determined to find the person responsible for taking Heather's life. They began to revisit old evidence and re-interview witnesses, hoping to uncover new information that might provide a breakthrough. The search for justice was far from over, and as each new lead emerged, it became clear that the true story behind Heather's murder would eventually come to light. As the investigation continued, Heather's family members remained hopeful that the mystery would be solved, even as each passing day added another layer of frustration and sadness. Who had killed Heather Rich? Was it someone close to her, or did the answer lie in a world that few could have imagined? In the next part, we will take a closer look at the ongoing search for justice and the individuals who have continued to investigate Heather's death, determined to uncover the truth that has eluded them for so long. As the investigation into the murder of Heather Rich continued to unfold, the lack of concrete answers left both her family and the authorities in a state of limbo. While there were no immediate suspects, the pain of uncertainty weighed heavily on Heather's loved ones. Her family, particularly her mother and close friends, refused to accept that the case might go unsolved. Their determination to see justice for Heather pushed them to seek additional help, knowing that the key to solving her murder was still out there. One of the critical steps taken by the family was to bring attention to the case once again through media outreach. They knew that public pressure could sometimes help to break cases wide open, so they worked with journalists and news outlets to ensure that Heather's story didn't fade into the background. The media coverage rekindled interest in the case, and the hope was that new leads would emerge from the public's collective memory. In December of 2016, just 2 months after Heather's death, a documentary filmmaker decided to take on the case. The filmmaker's goal was to create a compelling narrative that would not only highlight the tragedy of Heather's death, but also press authorities to intensify their search for the truth. The documentary's release brought renewed attention to the investigation, and Heather's family hoped that this would be the catalyst for a breakthrough. During this time, new evidence and tips started to trickle in. People who had previously remained silent or hesitant to come forward began reaching out to law enforcement. These individuals mentioned suspicious activity they had witnessed in the days leading up to Heather's death. However, the authorities were still left with little more than vague and incomplete information. One promising lead came when a witness described seeing a car similar to Heather's, parked in a secluded area near a remote highway. The description of the vehicle raised hopes that it might be tied to Heather's final moments. However, after further investigation, law enforcement found no direct connection to the case. The lead, while intriguing, ultimately didn't provide enough evidence to help identify a suspect. In the months that followed, Heather's family remained vigilant, continually asking for updates from law enforcement. They would frequently meet with investigators, hoping to hear that new developments were on the horizon. But as time passed, the frustration of dealing with a lack of answers only grew. Many of the people close to Heather, including her mother, expressed that they were losing faith in the ability of the system to deliver justice for Heather. Then, in early 2018, the case was assigned to a new detective who brought a fresh perspective to the investigation. This detective was known for solving cold cases and was determined to take a different approach in Heather's case. Under the new leadership, the investigation gained momentum. Evidence that had previously been overlooked was now being re-examined, and witnesses who had been contacted earlier were being re-interviewed. Despite the slow progress, the dedication of the new detective rekindled hope in Heather's family. They were cautiously optimistic that a solution might be closer than ever before. This renewed investigation also raised new questions and theories about who was responsible for Heather's death. Could it have been someone close to her, or did the mystery point to a completely different source of danger? One avenue that the new detective explored was the potential involvement of local criminal activity. It had been noted that in the months leading up to Heather's death, she had become involved in a number of questionable situations. Whether this was tied to her murder was uncertain, but the detective considered it to be an important piece of the puzzle. The theory that Heather may have become entangled in something dangerous made the investigation even more complicated. The ongoing search for justice in Heather's case became a cause for not only her family, but for the larger community as well. Throughout the years, local organizations and supporters continued to advocate for answers. There were rallies, protests, and social media campaigns, all aimed at keeping Heather's name in the public eye. Many people were still asking the same question: who killed Heather Rich, and why? As we move forward in this case, there is one question that still remains unanswered. What happened to Heather in those final terrifying hours before her death? In the final part, we will explore the lingering theories, the hope for a resolution, and the possibility that justice for Heather Rich may still be within reach. By October 10th, 1996, Heather Rich's body was discovered, and the investigation was already underway. Law enforcement officials from Montague County, Jefferson County, Oklahoma, the FBI, and the Texas Ranger Division collaborated. And the pieces of evidence soon pointed to the 3 teenagers involved in Heather's murder. On October 24th, the authorities arrested Joshua Bagwell, Curtis Gamble, and Randy Wood. Their stories were conflicting, but forensic evidence connected Bagwell and Gamble to the murder weapon. Gamble eventually admitted to being the triggerman, and in exchange for his plea deal, he testified against Bagwell. During Bagwell's trial, Gamble turned on his previous agreement and implicated Randy Wood as the shooter. Wood, in turn, agreed to testify against Bagwell, even at the risk of facing capital punishment himself. In the end, Bagwell was convicted, as was Wood. Bagwell received a life sentence with 99 years added, eligible for parole in 2036. Gamble, convicted of murder, received 2 life sentences, becoming eligible for parole in 2026. Randy Wood was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility in 2036. Though justice had been served for Heather, her tragic death left an undeniable mark on the community and her loved ones. This case serves as a grim reminder of how a series of reckless actions spiraled into irreversible consequences. The killers, now locked away, are a haunting presence in the story of Heather Rich, whose life was taken far too soon.